Like many players of a certain vintage, I too have a soft spot for the DarkSun setting. And the popular vote was that when we started to see psionics appear or manifest in playtest materials like Unearthed Arcana or recur in mentions from some of the game's designers, that might herald the forthcoming port to 5e of the apocalyptic desert setting. There is healthy skepticism, or speculation rather, around the appearance of psionics recently. And just like fans of the Eberron settings grow excited for the mention of their particular campaign setting getting that port to 5th edition, we too tend to get enthusiastic around any mention that DarkSun might be looming. Before we really go into that, let's understand how psionics had appeared and manifested in Dungeons & Dragons throughout previous iterations or editions. Psionics in Dungeons & Dragons goes all the way back to 1st and 2nd edition and other editions throughout the history of the game. The original iteration of psionics saw characters using a point-based system where you'd have attack points and defense points, and they'd almost function like brain hit points, if you think about it that way, or mental points, as it were. They were considered entirely their own system, and it was somewhat complicated and a little bit in depth in the early iterations of the ability and feature. We also saw a complete distinction between abilities that were available to psionics, and we're already seeing some of the titles carried forward into new playtest materials like Unearthed Arcana. For example, the Id Insinuation spell in Unearthed Arcana was previously a psionic ability back in 1st and 2nd edition D&D. Now, if you had a 16 or higher in intelligence, wisdom, and or charisma, then you had a chance to be gifted with psionic power. Like I said, those powers would come with a small pool of points to spend on attack and defense for your psionic abilities, but it was fairly in-depth and convoluted in early stages of the game. Additionally, it was treated with its own powers and its own abilities, not like spells or spellcasting mechanics that we see today. In the 90s, two key things happened for psionics: the launch of the DarkSun campaign setting and the complete psionics handbook were launched, which completely revised and re-delivered how psionics were considered in the game. Suddenly, psionics weren't treated as like a gifted option or something that could happen to your character, but rather a more distinct class that characters could specialize in or train in, just like you would any core class that exists in 5e today. This new treatment of psionics as a class far better served the concept of psionics or mental powers in the game, rather than kind of bundling them into something that was more of an addendum to the class that you had chosen. This mentality continued through 3rd and 4th edition, seeing psionics become more and more like a distinct opt-in or a discipline that characters would choose to train in versus something that was layered on. Now, based on what we've seen so far through playtest material and the fact that the first core class was only added with the official 5e Artificer in Eberron some 5 years after the launch of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, I believe we can reasonably assume that psionics will continue to be treated in this fashion as a subclass or a treatment to other core classes rather than a core class itself. Nonetheless, it adds an exciting new layer to the wealth of abilities that are available to players and DMs, and some exciting new avenues for campaigns like we've seen in the application for Eberron in the new and future modules and content pieces coming for 5e D&D. Whether or not that really does precipitate DarkSun on the horizon, only time will tell.